there is a long history of synergies between the various paleosciences in Indian archaeology. And through these dialogues, there are many issues that we constantly discuss, not only in the lab here in India, but also with all our colleagues all over the world, is whether we are really using holistic approaches or merely an application of multiple techniques. Do we tend towards too much of environmental determinism? Are the methodologies just an end in themselves sometimes? Do we really have dialogues, and are we really resolving conflicting results which come out of different studies? And what are the implications for funding, for publication and authorship? So in India in particular, let's situate this within the broader social and economic contexts. And all of us know that at least in India, there is an unequal prestige allocated to STEM versus liberal arts. So you can see that here. And this is in terms not only of institutionalized boundaries in disciplines, prestige in the social context, and all this has implications in terms of jobs, in terms of funding, therefore research outcomes, and variable weightage of publications in journals, choice of journals and authorships. No doubt this is changing owing to new educational philosophies which are widely being discussed in India, and hopefully this will have a very positive outcome in the future. Meanwhile, the reality of the fact is that there is inequality, although this is something that we hope to see. I put prehistory down here, but it can be archaeology or any archaeology related discipline, where we see that these disciplines must have an identity which is very distinct, theoretical frames of reference which are very specific and which need to be recognized and are often ignored. So what I'm going to talk about here is a little bit about evolving concepts and interpretations, specific issues which I'm going to focus on the Indian lower and middle Paleolithic and with particular reference to our own work, and then speak about something very close to us, that is moving from research to outreach. So all these layers in the past will come in, whether it's culture, stone tools, hominins, behavior, migration, environments, placing South Asia in a global context, and also issues related to conservation, sustainability, outreach, and legislations. So, very briefly, let's look at these synergies in Indian prehistory in the past. And this I have spoken of at Inqua Roma, but here's just a quick look at what I spoke there, a brief summary, in which we see that in the 19th century, research in looking at Indian prehistory was really holistic, lacking disciplinary boundaries, and exemplified particularly in the work of Robert Bruce Foote, where he brought together multiple disciplines to propose theories on past behavior. The next dynamic phase was in the 1930s and 40s, where we have the first emphasis where we see the construction of cultural sequences which are set within a climatic framework, either very local terrace sequences or stratigraphic constructions, especially in southeast coast of India and later near Bombay, Mumbai, but also on broader scales in the famous or infamous 1930s Yale-Cambridge expedition, which brought in global climatic correlations with the ice ages and a dual culture theory for the lower Paleolithic at least. And it was also a phase where there was a great emphasis on naming things, on nomenclatures, the Madrasian, on the homeland of the origin of all these lower Paleolithic cultures, which Oswald Mencken, for example, placed within South Asia in a tropical environment and others placed elsewhere. Migration started to be talked of. And of course, by the 1940s, with drawing of so-called boundary lines, distinguished as per cultural assemblages, geography and climate. So all this led to the establishment of conceptual approaches that were still valid till as recently as at least when I was doing my PhD, and a little even today in many articles. A breakthrough, I would say, was the work of Zeuner, who brought in new conceptual frameworks. The importance of geology, geomorphology, which was already there, but was set within the context of understanding human behavior. Chronology, using both geological contexts and archaeology. The past as a source for understanding the future, ethnographic analogies and adaptive strategies. And what is important is perhaps some of the early concepts of so-called Anthropocene in terms of human impacts at some of these prehistoric sites were also laid out. And then moving on, from the 1960s till today, many of the concepts are sort of time transgressive. They still prevail, in which you have correlation between grab samples from river sections with assemblages and cultural phases, and the influence of the new archaeology, where there was an emphasis on theoretical issues, nomenclatures, what we call things, ecological and geographic approaches, environment as a key, and the development of early science labs, archaeological science labs. At the same time, the critiques emerged of these, many of the approaches which were prevalent in terms of critiques of laundry lists of strata, tools, fossils, etc., excessive environmental determinism, many debates on what is the correct nomenclature to be used, and a critique of the loss of behavioral components, where you are overwhelmed by stratigraphy, overwhelmed by placing it within geological frameworks to the expense of looking at behavior. What is the current scenario today? The good, bad, and ugly I will come back to at the end of this talk. Now, before I come to our own work, what are the key debates we are looking at in the South Asian Lower and Middle in particular? Firstly, we have to acknowledge the enormous contributions made from the 19th century onwards, on whose framework, on whose foundations we build today. So there's an enormous amount of work which has been done. And if we deconstruct this further, we can look at certain time periods where concepts emerged, concepts disappeared, and some trends which continue through time. So I won't go into it in detail, but just as an overview. We also must note that the South Asian record is unique in terms of the richness of the lithic assemblages, the diversity of sites, and the range of geomorphological contexts in which we find sites indicative of hominin adaptations in diverse ecological contexts through time, that we will discuss further. So in the long history of studies in paleo environments, we have right now a wealth of information from multiple proxies and detailed reconstructions of paleo environments at specific sites or across regions. Yet, at the same time, we have sparse evidence to correlate hominin, for example, hominin fossil interactions in the earlier Paleolithic with direct evidence of, say, modified faunal remains at sites. There is a paucity of such evidence. Implications in terminologies such as the use of the word extreme, for example, in discussing extreme environments, which can be debated in the light of modern ethnographic studies and known human adaptability. Scales of analysis. Are we all looking at the same scale and making interpretations based on this? The importance of data from controlled excavations cannot be underestimated, with extreme caution required in interpreting sections or test pits, not in direct proximity to the excavation site or the primary site horizons. We'll discuss this a little later. This leads one to the very important aspect of taphonomy, whether at the level of the site, at the level of the artifact, the lithics, or proxies. Very few studies have been done on this in the Indian context, although more are growing over the years. And this has deep implications with respect to behavioral, whatever we postulate regarding hominin behavior, without a consideration of the depositional and post-depositional factors influencing sites. So this is something we require caution in. Similarly, as you all know, these are the traditionally divided cultural phases with approximate dates, and there are still issues in knowing whether there is anything which predates the Acheulean. There are issues in nomenclature. For example, you can see the late Paleolithic has many different theories regarding it, and issues related to the transitional nature. More important is how we categorize these cultural phases. So we like putting things in boxes based on the nature of the lithic assemblage, typology, and technology. However, this becomes a problem when we realize that there are many artifacts that are time transgressive and are not limited to specific boxes which we like to categorize them into, and the necessity to adopt holistic perspectives in factoring in the entire assemblage structure rather than specific type fossils, you may call it. Monitoring sample sizes and contexts become very important when we are linking this to chronology or making some inferences on paleo environment. So what are we talking about? Are we talking about a late Acheulean or early middle, or how are we categorizing things? So this is something that people are thinking about, are writing about, and we need to take further. In India, as the primary source of evidence we have are the lithics. So this is what has been said by a famous archaeologist, is we are squeezing blood from stones. And although the aim is ultimately to look at hominin cognition, or whether we want to look at inter or intra-site variability and global correlations, this synergies with various other scientific disciplines in studying the lithics, 3D geometrics or provenance or ergonomics or residue, microwave, etc., becomes a very crucial study in modern prehistory. So it's not something that you can just study the stone tools traditionally and leave it at that. It has expanded far beyond the disciplinary boundaries. This leads one to the concept of chronologies, in establishing chronologies in the Indian context. It is very important to constantly refine dating methods, and this is happening in various labs across the country. Professor Singhvi is here, and he can vouch for that. And interpreting results from excavated sites. At present, we still have sparse dates as compared to Paleolithic records globally, and even sparser chronological controls from excavated contexts. So, for example, if you have, this is just the lower Paleolithic Acheulean, and you can see these are very, very few dated sites as compared to the wealth of lithic assemblages across the country. And in this case, you have some sites which were dated quite a while back and which perhaps require re-examination. And this becomes very, very important because it leads to key questions related to debates on migrations, on paleo-environmental correlations, etc., etc. So, whether one is interpreting cultural transitions, whether it's local evolution, innovation, convergent evolution, migrations, hominin response to paleo-environment, it all rests on fundamentally strong foundation of chronology. So, this is one of the key factors which we need to really date far more sites. And this has implications for all our debates on migrations. Whether there is something predating the Acheulean and contemporary to the older one is still an open-ended question, and there are many papers which debate the existence or non-existence of these cultures. We definitely know that at least from 1.7 million years ago, we have Acheulean sites contemporary with those in Africa and parts of West Asia, and I'll be talking about this later. Modern human migrations is another big debate. As you all know, there are many schools of interpretation, some of which are correlatable with genetic evidence, others which are not. The takeaway is the recognition of the complexity of these stories, which is why if you see I have not put any arrows from here to there or back again, because it's far more complex than a simple arrow on the screen. And the presence of disagreements and lack of consensus, which is crucial for archaeological interpretations of the same. So here again, when we have the genetic story and the archaeological story, there are discrepancies. We must be cautious in species correlations, at least for earlier time phases, for example, parts of the middle. There is insufficient chronological controls from sites, and we must be cautious in large-scale models proposing one or the other routes of migration at this stage itself. This leads one to discussing some of the thoughts which arise from our own studies in northern Tamil Nadu, by which we hope to create a regional frame of reference which can address, at least on a small, tiny scale, some of these big questions. So here we are. I'll just hope this, it's working. So this is where we are working in this part of India, as you all know. And all these red dots are Paleolithic sites which we have mapped as part of our research. and sites occur in diverse geomorphological contexts along this particular region. So this region is really important because it was a place where not only the first discovery of a hand axe was made in the 19th century, thus pushing back the antiquity of the Paleolithic in India, but also many key concepts which developed from the 1930s onwards that still prevailed and influenced the theoretical and conceptual approaches not only in this study region but across India. Terms like the Madrasian became global. Concepts of river terrace sequences and correlation with stone tools also became widely copied elsewhere. So this is a very, very important region historically speaking. And then our own work started in the 1990s here, and we are trying to take it even further. And we are looking at landscapes, sites, lithics, chronology and paleo environments, and investigating hominin behavior at various scales of resolution, from very large questions which can be addressed at macro scales to the questions which can be addressed at the scale of perhaps a single tool. So across this region, there are sites of different time periods, and they occur in fluvial, lacustrine, colluvial deposits, primarily within ferricretes and ferruginous gravels, or various other argillaceous sediments, which you can see in the reds marked here. All the green dots are concentrated in the reds here. So as far as the lower and middle Paleolithic is concerned, on regional scales, what conditions site locations? For example, we have a cluster here predominantly with most of the lower Paleolithic Acheulean sites, whereas when we come to later time periods, the sites are all over. What conditions this? One factor is obviously the occurrence of suitable raw material and changing hominin behavioral patterns through time. But other equally important factors are the differential preservation of early to middle Pleistocene sediments and the presence of modern quarrying activities, which is very bad. It leads to the destruction of sites, but on the positive side also leads to exposure of deeply buried lower Paleolithic sites in particular that otherwise we would never have been able to find. So this is one important aspect of the region. Because of this peculiar combination of the diverse geomorphic contexts and their differential preservation, our survey and sampling strategies had to be very appropriately designed and ranged over an area of 8,000 square kilometers in collaboration with colleagues from ISRO, where both satellite data and the development of predictive locational models to save time and effort, because we really lack funds and in archaeology as a whole. And of course, transect surveys, walking over the entire area, test pits and excavations led to the generation of a huge database, which we are currently trying to systematize and will publish quite soon, hopefully. But this is a long-term study going on. In this huge region, we narrowed down to this core zone where we began selecting sites to excavate, like Athirampakam here, and then now Senra and Palyam over here, and some others which we are looking at, where all the other yellow dots also indicate Paleolithic sites, but we have not chosen to excavate them because of various taphonomical factors. But we will just look at what we are doing at these two regions. What are the lessons that are learned from Athirampakam excavations? It's a huge site. It's over 50,000 square meters of a visible boundary. And as you walk across the surface, you literally walk across a bed of tools, which are unfortunately decreasing more and more nowadays because of random collection. So please, when you visit sites, do not collect artifacts, take photographs, but don't collect. This is something we tell everyone. But the site has many, as you can see here, it's gullied. And this contouring is not only at the present, it also is something which happened in the past. So this site has been studied from the 19th century onwards. And interestingly, each group has come up with a different conclusion. So if you have the 19th century, Robert Bruce Foote said that this grey bit here are Cretaceous shales and the Acheulean occurs here in this gravel. Subsequently, again, this was the same view put forward in the 1930s. In the 1960s, with the first excavations, K.D. Banerjee and the ASI team said that perhaps the Acheulean occurs here underlying this bed. This is a post-Acheulean, and then there is a middle post-Acheulean continuing above. And in our own detailed excavations, we clearly noted that the grey bits here are not Avadi or Sri Perumbudur Cretaceous shales, but in fact are the true horizon for the lower Paleolithic Acheulean, following which there is an early middle which continues through time, and then the site is abandoned. So to substantiate that, our regional studies and excavations both at the site and in the vicinity of the site through test pits and trenches within the boundaries of the site challenged a century of geological classifications and led to a deeper understanding of where the original Cretaceous shales are located and how they were reworked during the early Pleistocene, along with some small pebble component, to be deposited in an area occupied by Acheulean hominins, thereby leading to a thick deposit building up through time. So this is the overall stratigraphy that we now know from many of the excavated trenches and with dates now. You have a very thick layer of a lower Paleolithic with Acheulean, which is layer 6, 7 and 8 below, followed by a middle Paleolithic, an early middle, and then the site is abandoned temporarily for as far as prehistoric occupation is concerned. To understand the subsurface variability in contours of different layers, not only within this boundary of the site, but also all around it, we have recently utilized GPR with Dr. Anand Pandey from NGRI who came over and are building up a sort of a subsurface stratigraphy, which helps not only in indicating the extent of different layers, but also helps us in redefining the concept of what do we mean by site boundaries and what was the actual potential area of occupation by these hominins through time. So the earliest occupation are the lower Paleolithic Acheulean horizons, and as you can see, these are really deep trenches that we excavated and revealed right from the top all the way down layers with these characteristic lower Paleolithic Acheulean artifacts in many trenches across the site, as also by careful sieving of all the sediments to recover very micro debitage and micro pieces that can help put together the entire story. So how old? For a long time, it was very difficult for us to convince geologists that this was in fact not Cretaceous. But ultimately, the archaeological evidence was a convincing proof, along with the fact that we dated using paleomag and beryllium cosmogenic nuclide dating. And the age estimates, we gave it a conservative 1.5 million age, but actually the dates range from 1 to 1.7 million, which place these contemporary with some of the sites in East Africa and the Levant. This should not have been surprising because there are other sites in Western India and Karnataka which also hinted at such old ages, and I'm sure there'll be many more sites in India with the same age once they are dated and published. So this should not be surprising, but it certainly challenges current at that time existing debates on the age of hominin when hominins migrated presumably out of Africa, or whether they did so at all, and what is the trajectory of the evolution of the lower Paleolithic within South Asia. So many questions occurred. Again, I refuse to put little arrows which would simplify the issue too much. We have some degree of variability in the intensity of occupation of these hominins at the site, not only temporally but also spatially. And this is seen in the types of tools, in their dimensions, and in the density per unit volume when we are quantifying this across the site. And this has implications in terms of how the site was used. Interestingly, even at this time period, there's a great deal of planning and anticipated use of the site by these hominins, because in these layers, there are no large boulders or cobbles which are suitable for making the large tools seen at the site. And the nearest sources of raw material are currently either deeply buried, but we could identify some in well sections, or located in nearby outliers of the Alikuli hill ranges, and they are outliers. And this we know that they did bring very large flakes to the site, but from where? So the first thing which we are doing is quantification of the nature of the quartzitic sandstones used at the site through non-destructive methods, which is going on right now. So we have sampled more than 200 artifacts, non-destructive, and also the sources which are somewhat problematic because they are conglomerate or gravel beds. So that's another issue. But this is also going up, which is helping us to actually not only look at the raw material used, but also to look at changing preferences in raw material in different tools and through time. So to put it very simply, when we look at the strategies used by these hominins, and this is a very complicated and I think very tiny schematic diagram, which you probably can't see very well, but this is more appealing. So somewhere elsewhere in the landscape, hominins were detaching large flakes from boulders, transporting these in various stages of reduction to the site where they were finished. We know that they were completed at the site because we get the waste products, and these waste products are typical for manufacture of predominantly of hand axes, and these waste products were often reutilized and made into tools, and certain proportion of artifacts were curated and carried away from the site. So this is just to show you the nature of the assemblage. We have characteristic large flakes which are typical of this Acheulean, whether in Africa or Israel or India, including a very characteristic technique called the Compeva. We have distinct patterns arising from 3D geometric morphometric studies of the hand axes and at this site, which indicates some variability in shapes, not only through time, but across the site as well, and which we are using now to compare with data generated from 3D models of the neighboring site of Sendra and Palyam, and we are going to compare this with sites of our colleagues in Africa. We also have a very important small tool component, which is made on waste products that primarily come from making bifaces. So there is an anticipation of the absence of raw material at the site, and therefore maximum utilization of whatever is generated, even at this early times phase, and the presence of some conjoinable flakes, which clearly indicate that the site is not extensively disturbed. I will not call any Paleolithic site in India primary in the sense that everything is exactly where it was left, but it's a matter of the degree of integrity. To understand this complex technology, we have an experimental lab in our institute, and Dr. Akhilesh is particularly reconstructing the technological strategies noted from the sites which we are studying. So these are very specific to the sites which we are working on in terms of the entire reduction sequence, some degree of some degree of microscopy, experimental tool use, and studies of the edge damage. We tried for residue and DNA at one point, but we failed. Nothing was preserved, but we have kept a number of samples of untouched artifacts from the excavation, which we are happy to share with anyone who would like to do more sophisticated analysis. So what's the next story? This is the oldest story at the site. What happens next? We have a disconformity, and then we have the deposition of these ferruginous gravels, clays, silts, and very fine ferricrete right at the top, and then a period when the site is abandoned. So with Professor Singhvi and his team, we dated these layers, and we obtained an age estimates ranging from 385 plus minus 64, something around 200, and then 172, and then the site is abandoned, or very few artifacts are found at the top. And what we do see is a change in technology from these very large heavy-duty flake tools or large bifaces, which gradually reduce in size. The appearance of some tools with some possible modification or tang, the appearance of the Levallois in some form or the other, and predominant change and adoption of small flake tool technologies. So what does this mean? One thing is, when we are looking at the question of who made these tools, we have been very cautious in our article, and I've said that we cannot associate this at present with any species. In general, the Middle Paleolithic in India has either been associated with modern human dispersals, or modern humans have been associated with microlithic technologies by other groups. But we suggest that this is a very complex issue, and the origin of these technologies is not only something which we are seeing developing locally, as at Athirampakam, with this change from large flakes which gradually disappear, to perhaps the arrival of some new extrinsic technological trends. Whatever it is, whatever was happening in India at this point in time is something which is also happening globally, as roughly around the same time period. And more data from sites which are in India are sure to come out with similar age estimates. Already some sites in southeast coast of India are coming out with quite old ages. And I'm sure this pattern is not unique. It will be seen elsewhere. In collaboration with our colleagues from the French Institute Pondicherry, from University of Kelaniya, and more colleagues are now joining us from University of Mangalore, Department of Earth Sciences, Pondicherry University. We are trying over many years to build up a story of the paleo environments and vegetation in this region. And we recently had a field trip as well. Dr. Vandana was there and many others, Dr. Pramod Singh and his team. And it's a very difficult area to extract information from, because we don't have faunal remains. We have been very lucky to recover phytoliths, which are showing some evidence of vegetation changes through time, evidence of increasing aridity towards the top, which can possibly explain the abandonment of the site. And also we have looked at issues of site taphonomy, clay geochemistry, and more studies are right now going on, which will help us to get a better picture of these very, very old and very difficult land sediments to work with. Whatever it is, we now have a picture of the same persistent use of this place in the landscape, but differently. So the way in which the Acheulean populations in a fluvio-lacustrine setting were using the site is very different from the way later populations, where there were braided streams, there are gravel beds, there are clay hills, there is ferruginous components which come in with or without the presence of rocks to make tools. So the way in which the site was used, the environment, whether local at the scale of a trench or even across the site, there is variation, and we are able to see the adaptive responses of different groups of hominins to these changing environments through time, till it was finally abandoned. However, it is impossible to understand a site by itself, and therefore we started recently excavations at the site of Senra and Palyam, which is, as you can see, very, very close to Athirampakam, but in a completely different context, at almost near the foothills of the Alikuli range and on a pediment surface. So while you have at Athirampakam an Acheulean and an early middle, at this site we have an Acheulean clear horizon and then a lower Paleolithic core and flake assemblage underlying it. So the stratigraphy is completely different. We have layer 1, we have 2 with an Acheulean, which is a gravel bed, and we have a ferricrete, which has this core and flake assemblage. And throughout, we are very lucky to get a number of conjoinable artifacts, like this flake fitting into a core, which helps us assess the enormous, very high integrity of the site. So this is a very intriguing assemblage that we are finding, with a scatter of cores surrounded by the flakes which were napped from it. And these studies are currently going on, and we are trying to date it with paleomagnetic, with some luminescence, and also with CRN. And I think by next year, we should get some good results arising from these studies. However, it is not enough just to, write papers which are in high impact journals. That's fine, but it doesn't really reach out to India. And in India, prehistory is somewhat neglected because of the wonderful built heritage that we have, sculptures, art, etc. So from 1999 onwards, we've had a very, very strong approach towards addressing children, local stakeholders in the villages that we work with, college, university students, and the public to develop pedagogical methods by which we can reach out to prehistory not only online but also more importantly through hands-on methods where you just get dirty with the earth between your hands. And we have written a number of articles on the ways in which we are trying to improve and refine our pedagogy, not only at the level of school children, but as Karthik said in the beginning, on how to teach. How do you teach prehistory? How do you teach stone tool napping to adults? And what are the implications not only for classroom environments, but also for understanding the past? So some of these have been in collaboration with the Paleo Home Project, another INQUA funded project. And others are published where we are looking at not only developing methods but also acting as a multiplier, so that the methods which are being developed in our institute over the last few years can be successfully adopted by various other universities and spread across the country. And this is actually in fact happening with a greater number of lithic napping workshops being conducted now pan-India. So as far as the diversity of participants, it's really important to target people in India from different social strata, rural, urban, etc. and to reach out particularly to children because this is the only way, sustainable way to ensure awareness and future conservation. To create alternate models of education, to connect scientists and participants. So generally when we have visiting scientists who have time, they speak to the children in our network and to communicate various ideas through innovative, immersive learning experiences and sensitizing people towards issues of conservation. And in the light of the philosophy of INQUA, to build workshops which we have done with French Institute Pondicherry in particular, through many interdisciplinary approaches to reach out to people and to break down traditional disciplinary boundaries which is commonly seen in Indian academia, plus substantiate that through online virtual models. Like Karthik said, the Down Ancient Trails series, which we are still continuing, was not only for adults with lectures, but also had a strong component for children, where we had a lot of hybrid online or virtual workshops, and developing workbooks or something like that, like this book which we just now came out with, which helps the learning process during any particular workshop. So these workbooks are specific for each workshop that we conduct, which help children get a better idea of what they are doing and help them to think critically about the past. So this is something that we are very passionate about. So we help to convey our research knowledge down to the smallest child, and above all integrate villagers whom we are working with deep time, so that they are the actual custodians of their own heritage and not us. Why is this so urgent? Because even as I'm talking, and I've said this in many lectures, this is what is happening to our sites. They are being bulldozed, and this is an important geo-archaeological heritage in terms of the ferricretes or laterites or whatever the sediments may be, which is unfortunate because we have a lack of awareness and a paucity of legislations to deal with this problem. And we worked with ISRO to quantify the impacts at 200 sites in our study region, and to actually get an understanding of what is happening at each site and propose a model which is site specific. I don't know how much that was successful, but we did it. So to end this talk, what is the current scenario in interdisciplinary studies in India? On the positive side, I see it's really wonderful with the increasing number of dynamic collaborations and applications of new methods in geochronology and paleo environments at sites. There is a huge movement beyond the traditional archaeological science lab because of increasing sophistication in the in instrumentation and therefore involving a wide range of laboratories. So you cannot do a study anymore in a single lab. It's probably split between 20 or 30 labs worldwide. And the skill training, which is interdisciplinary, is also very, very important because it leads to increasing exposure for students and ECRs, in particular in exploring archaeological questions. But on the negative side, one sees that we are at a nascent stage to grasp issues related to the sites, artifact taphonomy, questions of palimpsests, nature of cultural transitions, and the complexity of the archaeological record as a whole. There's a lot needed to actually develop understandings of this. Samplings, sections, strata and stone tools. Sampling of sections alone, which have a small or less archaeological presence, is insufficient to propose theories of major cultural changes or hominin adaptation to culture change, to climate change. This cannot be extrapolated on a pan-India scale. And the essence is excavations with an adequate sample size of artifacts is essential to address the big questions. Similarly, sampling near sites is insufficient and may result in major errors of interpretation owing to variability in the nature of the archaeological sedimentary layers, site formation issues, and other taphonomical processes. And this also results to studies of fauna or other material from surface sites, where we have the problem in archaeology of palimpsests developing which lack clear chronological contexts. Further, the causal relationships and excessive environmental determinism, in particular led by other paleoscientists, for example, linking monsoons with specific cultural events, where the human element is perhaps underplayed. Also, defining what constitutes an extreme event or environment and human response to the same may vary as per the cultural context you come from, and the need for an importance of accurate sample size and chronology before building large-scale models. We also need to sit together to resolve discrepancies in research results. This is still a major issue. For example, genetics and archaeological theories, or on human migrations or climate models, where there's still no proper dialogue which is occurring that can help us build some resolution to these questions. Lastly, regarding geochronology, there must be a resolution of discrepancies between archaeological expertise and the dates received to be done on par with mutual attempts to understand theoretical issues in the related discipline. So if I get a date which does not go with the cultural assemblage which I'm looking at, we need to really sit together and work out why that is happening. Is it a result of some site formation issue? Is it some other result or something of the sort? Domain knowledge of one field does not necessarily imply expertise in publishing on another field in the absence of collaborating scholars with subject expertise. And this is something which really we need to consider. And there has to be a growing, although it is growing, it's a slow recognition of the discipline of prehistory at par with other paleosciences, and to recognize it as an entity in its own respect, with its own theoretical, its own methodological history, and its own concrete conceptual base. So these are some of the things which we require: dialogues, debates, and deconstructions, and the need for building more synergies in looking at Indian prehistory. So with that, I conclude. I thank all the funding agencies, all the permits which we have obtained from the Archaeological Survey of India, Department of Archaeology, State Government of Tamil Nadu, the district collectors and officials, the villagers, volunteers, and all my colleagues. So thank you very much, and I'll stop here.